So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the spiritual turn in mathematics and how that sort of connects, or how I see that connecting to my work on querying mathematical proof. So in 2013, Gutiérrez argued that mathematics education was making a socio-political turn and was sort of making the argument that more and more educators and researchers were engaging with issues of identity and power in education and in education research. And this is a really monumental thing for the field because, as you might be aware, mathematics tends to be a little bit behind the times when it comes to adopting some of these more critical ideas. So in 2013, we are finally sort of seeing mathematicians, educators, researchers really grapple with the idea of mathematics as a socio-political object. Now, a decade later, we're seeing as that has become a more common approach to research and to education, Gutierrez has described the possibility of taking a spiritual turn. This is one that is including desire-based research and indigenous futurity as part of like a mathematical ethics and values. Um, and Gutierrez argues that this sort of like necessity of a spiritual turn is to move mathematics towards joy, justice, sustainability, humanity, kinship, these really affective and emotional ideas that we know as human beings are really powerful and impactful, but can sometimes get lost when we're thinking about education or research. I think sometimes when we're, you know, caught up in the theory and the methods of it all, we forget that on like a fundamental level, it matters that our students are experiencing joy in the classroom, and it matters that educators are experiencing joy because that's what makes this field something that is something both the students and the educators want to continue engaging with. Um, and so I really have been taking this stance lately of mathematics as a site of attachment, community, and kinship. And I love this quote from Gutierrez. She says, embracing relational understandings of knowing, existing, and healing that center values and ethics. So this spiritual turn is all about sort of looking ahead towards the future, looking towards joy, looking towards community as we move into mathematics education as a site of this attachment, community, and kinship. But when I think about sort of community, kinship, values, healing, I don't think about proof. For me, proof was a really harmful part of my mathematics journey. I, I think like many students, when I reached higher levels of mathematics in college, proof felt very foreign and very like an interruption of what I thought mathematics was and what I felt I was good at in mathematics because I am very good at algorithmic calculation. If you need someone to find a derivative, I can do that. Um, but proof sort of disrupted that idea of mathematics for me, but it disrupted it in a way that felt very punishing. It felt less like a learning experience or like learning a new language, which I know proof is sometimes compared to, and more like I was being punished for not understanding mathematics the way my professors wanted me to understand mathematics, not writing about mathematics the way people wanted me to write about mathematics. And to be clear, there's something to be said for having these sort of values and norms of proof, which we have in the field. They make it so that we can communicate as mathematicians across countries and sort of have a rigorous level of understanding of different theorems and axioms. However, for students, I think sort of holding them to that highest standard can be pretty problematic and can really discourage them from trying to present their thinking and really engage with proof in a way that's going to encourage them to continue engaging with mathematics. For me, I almost left the field completely. I was like, well, I have this dance degree I'm working on. Maybe I'll just commit to the arts because the sciences are it feels like they were pushing me away with these proof classes, which were constantly telling me that I was not writing things the way they wanted them to be written. So for me, proof represented a really big tension in my mathematics journey, and it's something I carried with me even as I continued pursuing mathematics in graduate school. Especially because, like, I know that proof can be a site of joy and healing. Proof doesn't have to be something that is epistemologically unjust or pushes students away. I think proof is actually a really interesting and fascinating aspect of mathematics. This sort of logical system we've built has a lot of really cool implications. And in other research projects, including my own, I've seen that proof can be really powerful, both emotionally, affectively, and intellectually. One example is I'm working on a project right now where we interviewed 20 different transgender mathematicians across the country at various levels. Some of them are graduate students, some of them are faculty, some of them are senior faculty. And when interviewing these transgender mathematicians, we actually found that like their experiences of like trans joy and enjoyment and playing with gender was really associated with their ideas of proof. Um, in one of these interviews, the participant was discussing how in their mathematics department, them and their sort of their cohort had been trying to come up with like a rigorous definition for a sticker. Like, how do we differentiate like a sticker from a vinyl or a decal or a magnet, sort of, having that sort of conversation. And they said that someone would have kind of a brilliant possible definition. And then we would shoot it back down. We would find a counterexample, and this is what we did for fun. The sheer joy in any one of us whenever someone had come up with a compelling new definition for a sticker. The only thing better than finding a definition was shooting down someone else's. So we see the sense of like joy and play in sort of proof, right? Up with that counterexample, being the person who says, "Oh, wait, we haven't considered this case. We haven't considered this element." Is really playful, and I think it's what brings a lot of mathematicians back to mathematics. Similarly, we had people really directly comparing their transgender experiences with their experiences with proof. Someone said, in being queer, there's fundamentally a questioning of axioms. Um, and someone else mentioned that the way I approached my own gender identity really fundamentally was a proof by contradiction. Which is just such a fun way to look at, someone, reflect on the self using this language of proof and logic. It represents this like queer joy that is compatible and in fact like uplifted by mathematics. So I know that proof doesn't have to be this sort of scary monolith of rules and norms and values. I know that it can be something experienced with a lot of joy and play and, push us to consider, the excitement of finding an edge case or reimagining a definition. Which is sort of what led me to this wondering, and it's kind of been central to my research agenda over the last several years, which is if I know that the epistemology of proof is not inherently at odds with this spiritual, affective queer turn in these queer epistemologies, how can we make those epistemological connections and resonances accessible for students? Because I feel and I know that sort of this a spiritual, affective, queer, vibe that I'm seeing with proof is so it makes me want to look at proofs. And I can't say that that's something I would do in my free time otherwise. And so when we're thinking about, students' retention, when we're thinking about having students engage with mathematics long term, especially high level mathematics where proof becomes kind of the do all end all, how can we make these sort of connections and epistemological resonances really accessible for students so that they can also engage in this form of like play, joy, and affective experience? And that's kind of what brought me to queer reading. So I'm not going to go super deep into the theories of queer reading, um, but I do have some quotes I want to share just because I think they kind of get the big idea across. So the idea behind queer readings is that queerness does not reside in the text, but is rather produced through the ever-changing relations between texts, readers, and the world. So the idea is even if an author is writing something completely unrelated to queerness, we can read it queerly by sort of looking at what it means for us to be in conversation with the text. Additionally, queer readings often focus on interrogating a text's binaries, hidden meanings, implicit authorities, implicit normalities, and other queer and non-queer elements, with the ultimate goal of challenging taken for granted norms and power structures. And we're going to come back to this language in just a second. Because some of you might be familiar if you're in sort of that proofy research area. Dawkins and Weber, the authors who've written so much about proof and are so foundational to our work in this area of the field, they kind of like looked across a lot of the proof literature and synthesized what they felt was kind of like the mathematical values that they were seeing in literature about proof. And so they created this list of what they saw as like the proof norms of the field. And that includes mathematics knowledge is justified through a priori arguments, Arguments should be acontextual, independent of time and place. Um, and then mathematicians want to increase understandings of mathematics, and mathematicians desire a set of proof standards. So these are sort of like looking across literature, what Dawkins and Weber saw, sort of consistent things that mathematicians care about. And if we look at some of these norms and values, I think that they're very connected with what we're being asked to do in queer readings. We're being asked to interrogate binaries, hidden meanings, implicit authority, I think is especially rife in proof. I think honestly, explicitly, proof contains a lot of mathematical authority. Similarly, there's a lot of implied normality in proof. There are certain things we see in proofs and certain things we don't see in proofs. And I think interrogating why that might be is a really rich place to start with any queer reading. And it also challenges taken for granted norms, which again have sort of evolved over the last 100 years of proof writing in the Western culture. If you look at proofs from more than about 100 years ago, they're actually really different than what you would see in a textbook these days. Proof is kind of an evolving concept. So even the sort of norms and values we hold for proof now, they're not necessarily the norms and values we've held for years and years. So, sure, okay. We're thinking about a spiritual turn, effective connections with proof. We're thinking about taking these things through queer readings. But, like, what does that actually look like? Because I know often reading these sort of like theory papers or hearing theory in presentation, it's just like, oh, you feel really invigorated. And then you're like, oh, but I gotta teach college algebra. So, what do I do with this? What does this actually mean to my work? And what does this actually look like potentially in a classroom setting or when working with students? Um, And that's a great question. So this is something that's going to be is kind of an ongoing project for myself. In fact, for my dissertation, what I'm hoping to do is uh, help instruct a class of introduction to proof and sort of introduce queer reading as one tool in the students' toolboxes and sort of gather data about sort of their experiences doing queer readings over the course of a semester. But regardless, queer reading doesn't really have a set of common practices or a task sequence that I can just kind of hand over to you. It is by necessity very unique and individual. It's dependent on the person, it's dependent on the proof, it's dependent on the day. And I think that's part of the beauty of it is that it is sort of like a kind of personal relationship between you and the text, you and the proof. Um, and I know that it can often bring proof sort of to a closer epistemic distance from the student. So, with all of that in mind, I'm going to do the teachery thing, and I'm going to make us do it because I always love inviting people into this process, into a queer reading. So I've got a URL. I'll copy it into the Zoom chat as well. But if everyone was to hop on a device, and maybe we'll take like 5 or 6 minutes to look at, I've put a proof that I have looked at extensively in sort of my own practicum project with students. Um, But if you want to look at that proof and maybe leave some comments, leave some doodles, sort of acknowledge what aspects seems queer, what aspects of it seems queer, where are you seeing implicit authority, hidden assumptions, all that good stuff that we kind of talked about. In fact, I will go ahead and copy sort of the text from the slide about queer reading into the chat as well as sort of a reference point, and then maybe we can look at this together. gonna give folks maybe 1 more minute to write down anything else they want to sort of add or draw any extra lines or shapes or annotations. All right. Now, this is something that I have spent like 45 minutes or an hour on a single proof doing. So I know we didn't get to dig into too much in just a few minutes here. Um, but I was wondering if people were willing to sort of maybe share out a little bit about what they noticed or what they felt while reading the proof, trying to take on this sort of queer reading lens. And just as a preface, like there is no right or wrong way to do queer reading. So if you feel like, I don't know if I was queer reading, maybe I was just making some notes, that's okay too. That there's no there's no bar that there's not a queer enough type of reading that we're trying to achieve here.
I'll go ahead.
Yeah,
Since you asked about feelings, I think, and actually you sent this proof to me, and
I
I used
know.
it in my class with two GTAs who are both queer themselves, so it was great. Um, but yeah, I like every time I see this, I'm just like, it's always feels so sterile to me. Um, the like norm of being really succinct. Is this always like I don't know. I just think I look at a lot of proofs and always just crave the writing in the margins and the train of thought. Like
Yeah, definitely. I definitely feel like I don't know where this proof is going until I've read it a few times. And, especially if we're thinking about like presenting proofs to students, why do we remove any sort of like hand holding? Or why is that a bad thing to like sort of describe, well, here's what the proof is going to achieve and then achieve it. Instead, there's sort of like, someone wrote here, induction is used and not explicitly set up. Yeah, it's like, oh, shush, 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 no one notice. And same, like the proof by contradiction kind of comes in halfway through without really any fanfare, without really explaining its purpose. Yeah. There's anyone else who wants to sort of share about what they were thinking during this process, or maybe something that they noticed about this proof?
Oh no, this is relevant, but it's very similar to the proof of infinitely many primes by Euclid. And it uses pretty much the same idea.
Yeah, yeah, which sort of begs the question, you know, if someone is unfamiliar with the proof by Euclid, is this proof still something that feels supportive of understanding the concept?
Did somebody have a thought about what seems queer to you? Like, did anybody look at it and go, wow, this is really queer here?
I'll sort of say, as someone who's interacted with this proof at length as part of my research, I will always find it very queer the way that notation is used in proofs. Like M equals comes kind of out of nowhere. And to me, it's just like a very strange sort of like naming and categorization that feels queer because of its like, I don't know, lack of coherency, maybe. Like why J and why K? Why those two letters in particular? And why M at the bottom? And yeah, that always feels strange to like queer to me. And I think the proof by contradiction as an idea, as like a big idea in mathematics, is very queer to me. The idea of like coming at it from that opposite direction and just looking for that edge case rather than that, more direct approach.
I feel like I've seen like an alphabet chart or whatever before where it's like nobody said that you like had to define the letters this way, but like we all know I, J, and K are vectors or like primes or something. Just like you do certain things and it's like, well, and if you break from it, it's like, why is this I don't know, a prime number or
Right.
something?
Right. If you can name your function f or g or h, but don't get too far out there, right? You rarely see a function e of t.
Or what is the one that's like gosh, is it theta? The one that's like, no, 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 the one that looks like this. Do you know what I'm talking about? Phi? Phi. People have
Phi is the
opinions about capital phi and like lowercase phi and different ways of like writing phi, like hard opinions.
Oh yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm gonna swivel us back to the presentation. And did your screen follow me over to the slides, or do I need to reshare? Awesome. I never know. Okay. Well, thanks for, being willing to do a little exploration with me, because I mean, part of the reason is just because I think it's fun and it's interesting and it gives you sort of hands-on knowledge of like what I'm talking about when I say queer readings of proof. It's like coming at it with this kind of interrogatory lens that is separate from proof comprehension. Like when I ask my students to query read proofs, I'm not really interested in them finding increased mathematical knowledge or understanding the mathematical argument more clearly, although that is often a result I've seen in the queer reading process. I'm more interested in sort of what that text and what the sort of norms in the text sort of give students or what they feel they still desire or want from a proof. So I'm going to be talking a little bit today about sort of like results of current research, and I'm not really going to get into any of the like research questions, methods, background kind of information, because I really just want to sort of show how students are feeling and are experiencing this queer reading process and how I think that connects to this sort of spiritual turn in mathematics. Um, but to give you just enough background to maybe understand the results, these participant quotes we're going to look at together come from my practicum, where I invited a group of queer mathematics students, some were undergraduates, some were graduate students, to conduct a collaborative queer reading of proof. So we spent like 90 minutes together looking at that proof that we were just looking at together and kind of deconstructing it as a group. And my participants were Atticus and Jeremy. Those were both third year undergraduate students working on degrees in both mathematics and teaching in our College of Ed. They both use he, him pronouns, and they were like close friends already before the research took place. They were cohort mates. So it was nice to have them already be very comfortable working together. And then we also had Audrey, she, her. She is a third year, I guess she's now in her fourth year graduate student pursuing a PhD in nuclear physics, which is really cool, but she had gotten her degree in mathematics in undergrad. So she was kind of coming to proof from a long hiatus away, which was really interesting to sort of get her perception from that sort of like, having moved on to some very like applied mathematics versus pure mathematics. And then there was me. At the time of the data collection, I was a second year graduate student, and I am now in my third year, but I'm still pursuing a master's and a PhD in math education and math, respectively. And our query reading process sort of involved the creation of what I call a proof de-reconstruction. And I know it's really small to see here. I'm working on a manuscript right now, which I'm going to be submitting to Jeremy in another month or two. Everyone cross your fingers, where we sort of break down what the query reading process was like for these students and how this proof de-reconstruction came to be. But you'll see we had a lot of annotations. We invented our own definition for a triadic prime since it wasn't given to us. Um, we like added a lot of emphasis, color, all these notes. But like I said, today I really want to focus less on sort of this creation of our proof de-reconstruction and more on sort of the student reflections about their experiences in this queer reading process. So in their reflections, Atticus, Jeremy, and Audrey all sort of characterized their prior experiences with proof as dull or rigid. I think someone even used that word sterile explicitly in their reflection, Kelsey, when they were thinking about sort of past ways they've looked at proof. But then in this study, they said they were able to sort of like find some new and invigorating ways to think about proof. And that was like really exciting to see because you make these hypotheses and you hope that you have someone who can say, yeah, what you're doing was cool and was fun and was supportive. So Atticus says, honestly, it was so phenomenally different. I think being in college level math classrooms has perpetuated the unqueerness and rigidity of math for me. This process was so, so healing for me in my math soul. I feel like I can embrace looking deeper into proofs and even rewriting them so they make sense to me. Which I really love how this sort of takes on that personal ownership over proof, sort of giving Atticus agency to interact with the proof in this more, I think, effective way. Jeremy stated that reading proofs can become quite monotonous, so switching things up in the way it was presented and finding new ways to look at the text was exciting. Uh, in all, reading proofs queerly proved to be an exciting endeavor that made math seem more creative and less sterile than I am sometimes used to in an academic setting. So for Jeremy, this process of queer reading kind of like brought some new life, some new entertainment, some new sort of interest into proof, where, I think when you're studying proof for your math classes, day in and day out, it can get a little bit a little bit mind-numbing. And so it was exciting to see Jeremy describe this process as a way to sort of shake things up and feel a little bit more invigorated. Audrey wrote, the idea of reading and writing proofs stirs a feeling inside me. Not a good feeling, but not a bad one either. The issue is that proofs are typically quite boring. If I had to assign an analogy, I would liken it to a puzzle of slightly different gray pieces that, when perfectly assembled, looks like a blob of dullness. To contrast with this, my experience with Davis and the others attempting to queer math in whatever way we could was filled with color and excitement. So Audrey is also sort of feeling that sense of like color and creativity reintroduced into proof through this process, similar to Jeremy and Atticus, which is so exciting to see as the researcher here. We also had Atticus and Jeremy kind of reflecting on their sense of safety and comfort doing the queer reading process. And I'll say this could be because of the queer reading process itself, or it could just be that, working with a group of explicitly other queer mathematicians, I think really let us build sort of a community that supported this sense of like safety and comfort in taking risks. So I don't want to say that this is automatically what everyone might experience in a queer reading. I think this is a process that can feel very vulnerable, but in this context of this study where we were all queer, I think it became a really supportive space. So Jeremy stated, the first thing I thought of was the level of safety I felt in reading proofs queerly rather than in my previous academic settings. Expressing math in a way that more catered to a level of curiosity and creativity rather than hindered by academic stress played a big part in how I felt while reading proofs with the group. So I think this queer reading process for Jeremy took away some of that intensity of having to understand the mathematics really clearly or be able to explain it to someone else or sort of demonstrate competency with the mathematical material and instead let him interact with the proof in a more effective and creative way. Atticus said that reading proofs was not fun for me. I felt like I was always behind in my classes because none of us talked to each other unless you already knew someone. All of us looking at the proof in this second activity had me really nervous because I thought I'd be the only one not understanding a lick of the proof in front of me. But then we actually started and we all had the same questions. So Atticus is talking about sort of past experiences with proof, feeling uncomfortable speaking up in class, feeling like they're the only one who's not going to understand. But in this setting, they were able to find a lot of like community and support, and find that like everyone finds proofs to be something that takes a little bit of like working towards understanding. I think there's maybe an idea that once you get to a certain point of studying mathematics, they just all make sense. And yeah, Kelsey, I saw your comment about epsilon proofs in the chat, and yeah, I will never completely understand an epsilon delta proof, and that's okay. I'm still a mathematician, and that's, epsilon can remain a mystery to me, as long as you don't talk to my analysis professors. So I guess what I want to talk to you about to sort of round out this discussion is kind of like what's coming next. So I've sort of been thinking of queer reading as this way to engage students creatively and effectively. And so when I'm looking at what's next, I'm seeing queer reading as something that could potentially be a really powerful tool in sort of our toolbox of having students learn to interact with proof. I think it's really important for students to learn the norms of the field and to be able to read normative proofs in a supportive way and to be able to write proofs in normative ways if they're interested in proceeding through sort of like our Academy of Mathematics. I don't think what proofs look and sound like is going to change radically anytime soon. And I'm not necessarily arguing that it needs to, but I think this queer reading process can kind of dismantle some of the barriers between, you and the text and you and the proof and you and this like big idea of a fancy mathematician in a big fancy office with their big fancy chalk. Like, I think it really lends itself to seeing it as something that is human and creative and in many ways functions as kind of like a representation of our understanding. But if it doesn't represent your understanding, you can make it represent your understanding, I think, in some ways through this queer reading process. So I see this as sort of like a supportive critical tool as we move towards the humanization of proof instruction, which is something that's been like a recent topic in the literature in undergraduate mathematics education. I also think it speaks to that spiritual turn I was talking about earlier. I think it's an enticement for students to experience joy and justice in proof classrooms. So I see this as a way to push proof research further, both sociopolitically and spiritually, as suggested by Gutiérrez. A lot of research on proof instruction has remained highly cognitive and really related to student outcomes, student comprehension, student persistence in mathematics. And while those different measurements can be valuable and can have their place, I think we also need to think about students' joy and futurity in mathematics and sort of bring this spiritual turn into proof, because I think that those are not in tension, right? The logic, the structure of proof isn't inherently in tension with this sort of creative, joyful aspect of mathematics that Gutiérrez is inviting us to inhabit. So that's kind of what I had to share with you guys today. I am so thankful for your attention, and I'd love to keep chatting if anyone has time to stick around.
Well, that was great. So any questions for our speaker?
I have a question. Davis, thank you so much. This was incredible. And oh my God, love gay things. This is great. Just your thoughts on thinking about the difference, maybe contextual differences. I do a lot of research on graduate students and thinking about their experiences. And I guess like from the folks that you were like working with, like were there sort of like differences in like the crude experience to sort of then like this intervention of like sense making of like, because I can see maybe second or third year undergrad student encountering this and it's like this like profound way like they're sort of being introduced to proof construction early on versus a PhD candidate in pure math with this sort of like accrued years of doing math in this way and sort of like were there sort of like differences in terms of like how they were reflecting on the experience based on their kind of like the differences in like accrued math in like the formal sense, just any thoughts on sort of like how this would look different for undergraduate and graduate students who are engaging in proof construction?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely something to be said for like that entrenched knowledge. I think over your time in mathematics, you do sort of adopt the language and the norms without thinking too hard about it. I definitely will be, I do all this like, proof can look different and feel effective. And then in my math homework, I'm still writing like, clearly it follows, da da da, kind of playing into what we see as sort of a stereotypical proof language and structure.
Right.
In this research project, Audrey, so she was the one who is getting her PhD in astrophysics or nuclear
Mhm.
physics, which how cool, how exciting, literally a rocket scientist. Um, she had done her undergraduate in mathematics, but I think for her, she was the one who was, I think, most, I don't want to say stumped, but I think hesitant
Mm.
to sort of contribute or like get things going during our queer reading process. And I do think part of that was because through her experience getting a degree in mathematics and then moving into like the
Mm.
field of like physics, where there's a lot of applied mathematics, and it is very like it's very important, I believe, to get that math right
Mhm.
when you're working with nuclear science. And I think that did create a little bit more of like a tension of like, but this is like this proof is normal. This proof is just how we write proof. Like I think there was a little bit of that kind of
Mm.
accrued sense of normalcy,
Mhm.
whereas Jeremy and Atticus, who are both third year undergrads, they've definitely taken several classes with proof, but I think they were a little bit more eager to jump in and mess with it in a way that I think
Mm.
me and Audrey, who have more experience with proof, felt a little bit more precious
Mm.
about the text.
Right, right. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Good to hear from you, Royce.
This is making me think about first. Thanks, Davis. I appreciated hearing an update on your work after so many years since
Yeah.
I think read something you wrote. Anyway, um, so you were emphasizing queer reading specifically today and in what you were sharing. But building on what you were just sharing and some of the things that Royce brought up, I'm thinking about queer writing and queer practices of proving and kind of like the transition to the like, all right, so we've done the queer readings, we've reflected on things we're noticing, and thinking about, okay, so how do we then give students the space to prove in the ways that make sense to them and build, I guess, kind of their own genre of proof to a degree, or at least build a recognition that the genre of proof that we have today is different from the genre of proof in the past and the genre of proof that the Greeks used, and therefore there are many different genres of proof that are valid and acceptable. It's kind of just dependent on the community and who you're talking to. I guess I'm curious. I'm kind of thinking about that next piece. And if you're thinking about some of those things, or even if when you were working with folks, were people making that next step thinking about, okay, so we've done all this queer reading and reflected on our experiences. What next? How can we queer what we're doing in the future? I'm just curious to hear some of what's come up and also some of your thoughts, essentially.
Yeah, no, those are really great questions, and I love that sort of what's next approach. I will say I'm a little bit of a coward here. I worry about asking the field to accept proof that doesn't look the way we expect proof to be. I've gotten a lot of pushback on my work when I'm just asking us to read proofs differently. And so I think I have been hesitant to think too hard about, well, what if we did write them differently? What if there was other ways to present logic? But I think it is an important conversation for us to start having, especially in the context of students in like an intro to proof course or like a beginning level analysis course, where this isn't like these proofs being presented in on exams or in homework assignments, they're not going to be published in some math journal, right? This is just representative of the student's understanding. And so I think there is room for educators to start thinking about like how we grade a student's sort of contribution of a proof and how we think about what an expected like proof rubric should look like in that kind of course, right? Is there a little bit of leniency in terms of format, in terms of language? Like if we're representing those big mathematical ideas, does it matter if we're using this really Eurocentric, like unemotional language? So I definitely think that that would be a really cool thing to start talking about in terms of like how we interact with students proving artifacts in especially in undergraduate education. I will say that's probably a little bit down the line for me because of my fear of getting published. I would love to be published. And I think this is already causing some waves, which is exciting, right? I want to be causing waves. I want to be disrupting a lot of this work, but it is hard to tell a mathematician, well, what if we did things differently? They don't like that, I have found. But I think that's an important question, an important thing to like push for in the future.
Mm, I like this conversation. Yeah, thank you again, Davis, for the presentation. And it's making me wonder, like, okay, where is the fear and worry coming from? What needs to be questioned and dismantled? I think what comes up for me is the publish or perish, that you're not going to keep your job if it doesn't end up in a journal that a committee of people have decided is worth you keeping your job for, and choosing that and quantities over other things that could be valued. Otherwise, why not have, you can already prove the Pythagorean theorem with pieces of paper that you cut out, and you could make a YouTube video, and somebody could say, look at this YouTube video. Let's save let's save this video file in an archive somewhere, and now we have it. Here's a proof, and someone will look at it and go, wow, that's so true. That's so stinking true. Um, so like in a world where we could just do that or write storybooks would be quite beautiful. And I wonder if the fears and worries comes from mostly that, because it's like how we share this knowledge. And I don't know. Feel like people are worried about jobs. Maybe they're worried about status or other things, but I don't know. Rainbows. I envision such nice things for society.
Yeah, it all comes down to capitalism a little bit at the end of the day, unfortunately. I think it all comes back to just I would love to have insurance and, eat. But I think another aspect of this sort of fear element is sometimes when I talk about my work, because I'm working on my master's in mathematics, and I'm always the only person who isn't in the PhD math program at MSU. I'm like the only like sort of interloper, and so on several occasions I have like come into the class and they're like, "Well, you introduce yourself, and we all know each other." And they'll ask me about like what education research looks like, and when I talk about my work, they become very defensive of like what mathematics with like a capital M is and should be. Like I think it definitely has this very like it's sitting on this very white Western pillar of like objective reality, and I think it can be difficult sometimes to explain how mathematics is subjective and mathematics is sort of a human construct that we hope to overcome its flaws. We hope to not have any holes in logic, but we'll find people disproving things we've believed were true for years and years, and then suddenly our whole paradigm shifts because we found that edge case, we found that counterexample, which I find like really exciting about mathematics, the idea that it is sort of this shifting, evolving construction of knowledge. But I think for a lot of mathematicians, especially those who are entrenched in this academy that has told them that success looks a certain way, and that if they write their proofs a certain way, they can get published and they can build acumen in the field, right? Disrupting that, in a sense, sort of disrupts their sense of self as a mathematician. And I think that's something even I felt, right? I think being a mathematician carries a certain level of like, oh, I must be so smart. I must be so like intelligent and powerful to understand these ideas. And it can be a little humbling to sort of start to dismantle some of those like cultural values of mathematics. And I think that's what this process in part asks us to do.
It kind of reminds me of, so the way that I think about or have been thinking about, it's not the research I do, but I do need to teach this at some point. Again, it's been a while, I guess. But now that I am doing that, sorry, cat balancing on things that are about to fall. Um, the way that I've come to proof and thought about it, especially because I use literary theories and things, I think about it in
Mm,
terms of genre and the aesthetics of genre. And
yeah.
at a critical and social justice historians writing workshop that I went to, the application materials I put in are essentially like, okay, so basically, if I teach proof at any point, I'm teaching people how to write. I mean, in some contexts and places, that counts as a writing course for some people, right? So what if we use the analog of like, okay, we're teaching people how to write. How problematic would it be if we're like, you must write like this? There are exceptions, but we're going to write like this. I feel like that combined with some of these queer readings has a lot of power to realize like, oh, that's deeply, deeply problematic that we believe this, even if that is the overarching, myth. And it is easier to write things in certain ways as far as people reading them and being like, yup, it fits the norms. But it makes me think about what the possibilities are for opening up at least a first proof class for some of the space to explore some of these queer possibilities and genre bending possibilities while acknowledging the overarching like genre norms and things that certain sub communities at least in mathematics hold so that people can make decisions about how they express their, well, we'll say queerness through their proof, queerness, neurodivergence, whatever. I mean, I'm thinking in terms of neuroqueering myself recently. So anyway, that was kind of a screed, but I appreciate you at least leading me to think about some of these things again.
Yeah, yeah. I think your work with like, storying mathematics is definitely related to these ideas. Yeah, how cool would it be if we could start to like, because I think there's room for like both, right? There's room to like teach students
Right.
that proof doesn't have to look like this, and there's room to tell students if you continue in mathematics and you want to be a professor, you want to be a researcher, there are expectations for what your proof eventually looks and sounds like. But that's not something we need to inflict on students from
Right.
the very beginning.
I
Yeah, I think
mean,
there's definitely room for
I'm
that
thinking
growth and
too,
play.
why would we believe in a binary, right? We're talking about queer theory. So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. But I like that analogy of like we wouldn't tell people to write like you wouldn't take a poetry class and then the poetry teacher's like, and we're only gonna write in iambic pentameter all semester
Right.
long.
And mathematicians too are really open to saying that they see themselves like math as an art form. So I feel I've had experiences with work with mathematicians where if you lay things out in a certain way, they're like, oh yeah, that is deeply problematic and harmful. And I've probably had this not so great experience at one point in time where I wanted to do it this way and it didn't go so well, or some reviewer was mad. I
Right.
don't have the answer either, obviously. I don't even think specifically about proof as much as you do, but it kind of I just like hearing about things like this because it keeps helping me see some of the possibilities for the conversation moving more in that direction so that maybe people are first taught to think about proof very differently, which then hopefully has a knock-on effect and sometime down the line changes
Yeah.
what is seen as normal, right?
Yeah, and changes whose voices are heard in mathematics and who has the opportunity to progress forward.
Yeah,
Yeah. I think
yeah.
that comes back to that sort of indigenous futurity that Gutierrez talks a lot about in the
Mm.
article on the
Oh
spiritual
yeah,
turn. Yeah.
I love
Wait,
that connection.
actually, I forgot that was the main thing I wanted to ask about because that was like the big framing of this was
Mm.
about the spirituality.
Sorry.
And I wanted to hear more of your thoughts on like what that means to you. Like how is that like related or different from thinking about affect? Like yeah, what does taking a spiritual approach mean?
Yeah, yeah, it's something I think I'm sort of still in the process of understanding for myself. But for me, I think Gutierrez, the way they talk about spirituality in mathematics, there is that affective element of, but I think there's also a communal element, the idea of mathematics in community with other people, sort of contesting that narrative of like isolation in mathematics. Um, And then in addition, there's the sort of indigenous futurity element, which Gutierrez sort of describes as like finding, I'm going to do, I want to make sure I'm using like appropriate language here. Like I think there's something about this sort of indigenous connections to land, to water, to things that are not human. Um, and so if when we sort of look at mathematics as both human and inhuman, right? It's both something we have created and something beyond ourselves. We're able to sort of like think about its future in relationship to like these natural elements in the world and with its relationship to humanity. And so I think, and then that futurity aspect sort of pushes us to think about like what things can look like going forward in a more hopeful decolonial like vein. And so I think my research, I play a lot with the affective and emotive experiences, but I see it as being sort of framed within this spiritual turn because I think, as maybe demonstrated by some of our conversations today, it's sort of my way into the conversation of what it looks like for mathematics to become more accessible and to become something that we can sort of touch with our two hands and let everyone sort of touch with their two hands as we sort of move forward. So that's kind of my conception.
Thank you.
Kind of makes me think about, I'm coming in with the stories again, but connecting to the indigenous piece and futurity in particular. What I found interesting is reading indigenous storytelling and also like the ethics and aesthetics around that and different genre ideas. Well, first of all, playing like time being very circular and recurrent, but also like a lot of their stories will just start in the middle somewhere because there's no clear beginning or end. You kind of just start where you are. But it also makes me think about if we thought of proofs more in terms of genre in a form of storytelling or narrative, which some people debate, but you know, you could kind of think about it like that if you're moving it more in a humanities like writing-y direction, like I was thinking in terms of. It makes me think futurity, indigenous futurity, specifically about the ethics of storytelling and how that is a very specific piece of indigenous culture where like somebody telling you that you can retell their story is a big deal. And otherwise, a lot of people expect that you won't retell the story without asking because every single time the story changes, things like that. And I'm no expert in this, but it kind of makes me think about how, in many ways, when students are doing proofs, they are storytelling and story retelling. I mean, a lot of retelling when it comes to proof, right? But everybody has their own variant. And it makes me think about the uh, cyclic nature of this in a way, but also like how are people engaging in ways that make sense to them, both like bodily, emotive. Anyway, that's kind of just a tangle of ideas, but
It's like honoring the giants whose shoulders you stand on. Is what that
Yeah.
makes me think
that
of.
too, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we're retelling these stories because we found their logic so compelling
Mm.
all these years later. That's a really, I think, beautiful way to think
Yeah.
about it.
That also is making me think about one of the biggest things that I think usually gets me to understand a proof. I always just would look at a theorem and go, the fuck do I care? Like, and just like what made you go, you know what? This has got to be a theorem. Like, for real though.
Mm.
And then, because then I'm just like, okay, I'm with you in sussing this out because part of the proof is usually like, oh, I stumbled upon this proof because I thought this thing might be true. And a lot of times the ways in which it becomes true is related to the reasons you thought it might be true in the first place. At least I get that sense.
Yeah.
And
Mm.
I feel like I always
Mhm.
want the sort of like, why do we care? Which I bring that up because I think you're talking about like the ethics of proof and like I think that could be connected to it too.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to, Matt, you've been such a lovely like facilitator. I want to leave room in case you had any thoughts or questions.
I mean, I'm just kind of thinking about, the demands of proof, not necessarily for publishing, but for communication,
Mm.
between mathematicians, um, and how that kind of very informal discourse where the audience is very specific, could be looked at,
Yeah,
particularly in things that do tend to attract more, um, more queer mathematicians. Like
topology.
it's kind of like well known, I guess.
Oh yeah.
I don't know how well known it is, but
Yes.
category theory is like a
Yep.
very kind of queer friendly field. And that has so many kind of norms of discourse around it that I don't really understand, and I don't really understand like what yeah, there are a lot of arguments in category theory that are difficult for me to decipher, and I don't know how much of it is like a skill issue on my part that I don't understand the math, or that I don't understand the kind of discourse at hand.
Mm,
So I think that would be a really interesting place to take this research.
yeah.
And I also
I
have
think
like,
that I was
oh
gonna say,
yeah,
I think that that's a great point about how like even within different niches of mathematics, there are completely different expectations and norms and I think that is really cool to think about. Yeah.
yeah, and it is kind of just yeah, the different kind of communities, um, and their relationship to proof, right? When they're not being asked to prove things for like an authority, but for each other,
Mm,
is something that I think just broadly is not well investigated, at least to the extent that I've seen. But
yeah.
that's just that's how I've been thinking about like your work in here, and also what I've seen at Room and so on.
Yeah. I think you're really onto something there of like even mathematicians when they're in collaboration aren't using this sort of formal language or structure. It's often a lot more like loose and human and I think communicative. And it isn't until sort of the end of a project or when we get to a finished, oh, we figured out the proof, now we go back and we tidy it and polish it and make it concise and make it what we would consider sort of sterile or following these
Hmm.
norms. So it is interesting that like mathematicians really don't even work this way except when refining a finished product.
Hmm.
Which, I think is maybe worth talking to students about and saying, like, don't expect your thinking to look like this all the time or to come out like
Hmm.
this all the time. Because I
Yeah,
think I
yeah.
definitely, when learning proof, felt like, oh, I don't think like this. Maybe I'm not built to be a mathematician, which, is clearly not the case. But yeah, I can feel like, oh, this is the way the field thinks or works. And that's just not, I think you're right. I think that's just not true. Yeah, good insight.
Hmm.
I've
Um,
definitely read some texts in ethnography where I thought to myself, you literally wrote this using the most obscure words possible so that I would look at it and go,
As inaccessible and theoretically dense.
I'm not good enough for ethnography because I gotta get a dictionary out to read this. Like, what?
Yeah, I have that tension with, I apologize, my parrot is yelling. So if you hear that, fire alarm. It's fine.
No,
It's
but that's
just a
amazing.
bird.
And can I see your parrot?
Sure. He's in his cage right now. There he is. Oh my
Yay. I was just
God.
thinking of him recently for some reason, but it's been a while.
Yeah. He went to the vet today for his annual checkup and he is in perfect health. What I was gonna say, what was I gonna say? Kelsey, you just said something, and I was gonna respond to it.
Ethnography, being
Yes, I
obscure.
feel I feel that way a lot about like I'm really into like critical methods and like post-qualitative research methods because those are very compatible with queer theory. But some of the post-qualitative researchers out there, I think just love to hear themselves talk and not really say much at all. And bless their hearts, I'm sure they have great things to contribute, but it's completely inaccessible to me as someone who genuinely wants to understand and do similar work. But like, girl, use a two-syllable word, a one-syllable word. I'm tired. And I think it makes it hard for scholars who are interested in engaging in that kind of work to like do it, you know?
Mm. Oh my God, literally just today I was like, I think I'm gonna use grounded theory on this. Ooh, but like it's actually appropriate this time. It's like I will not advocate for grounded theory out of nowhere. It's like only if I
Mm,
actually think it's the right thing to be using.
yeah.
Yeah.
I know what you mean. I actually just sat in on Betty St. Pierre's post-qual class recently.
I love St. Pierre, but
Hmm.
girl.
Hmm. We, along those lines, yeah, sorry. Yeah, we read a lot of her things, and it did take like the whole semester to get a sense of like, oh, it's interesting because you kind of like get the vibe after a while, and that's what I've
Yeah.
gathered is what they're going for. But it definitely took a semester of vibing before I was like, right. But then I was talking to Saul actually recently, and he was like, wait, where'd you read that? And I was like, I kind of just know it now because I've vibed enough. It's interesting. Like I very much I feel that critique,
Mm,
but have learned that there's something about the vibing, and I'm trying to figure out like where's the reasonable intersection of vibing
Yeah.
while keeping it accessible vibing.
oh my God, the queering of like research methods, like oof,
Mm.
Yeah.
oof, that's ripe space.
Oh
That's such
yeah.
a ripe space. Makes me think about how I
Yeah.
did a narrative inquiry for my dissertation. And like I was kind of pushed back on quite a bit because it's like Jean Clandinin, I don't know, she's problematic. And I'm like, yes, and I'm still gonna use it in my own way.
Yeah.
And then I didn't get as much pushback when I go to Ford. I'm like, okay, there you go.
And also like everybody cites that person for narrative inquiry.
Right.
So I'm like,
Right. Well,
kind
she,
of
I
have to.
don't know how rigid she is truly, because like if you read what she writes, there's a lot of like room for creativity. And also
Yeah.
she's very like very belligerent about narrative inquiry is different and special from just like narrative, which I also get because it's like it's not just the phenomenon, it's the method. And I'm like, okay,
Mm.
we can say all that and also have some room for, I don't know, additional creative thoughts.
For sure. For sure.
Well, clearly this framing that you've brought to us today is very generative, Davis. So I'm excited to see what comes next.
Mm.
Yeah, I am so grateful that I found an area of math education research that truly is just fun to play around in. And I'm really excited to see
Mm.
other people who are enjoying talking about it. So, if you ever want to talk more or if you have ideas for collaboration, reach out. I'm happy to talk more. I never shut
Oh.
up is something you'll learn about me. I wrote like no one wants my practicum paper was like 18,000 words long. And my poor sweet advisor, she was like, no one asked you to do this. No one made you. And I was
It
like,
was
I
for
know,
you.
it was for me and I couldn't
It was
shut up.
for you. Oh my gosh, I'm
Thank
excited about your interviews with 20 transgender people and what they said though.
It's
Like I was making eyes with
you.
I was making eyes with my wife because she has a PhD in math and literally her friend like explained like part of how she realized like she has another like one of her friends who I've gotten to know is also trans woman. I was talking about like literally how I've like been discovering is like I did like a proof by contradiction because they're both words. And it's like that's so funny. It's just like, but I can't be so counter examples. Anywho, I love that.
Yeah. We're working this summer on a paper on trans epistemologies of mathematics, and we're using diffractive analysis. It's going to be very fun. I'm very excited about it. It's with Reagan and
Ooh.
Kyrie.
That's right.
Oh,
A
I
great
love
team. I just get to
them.
hang out with all my trans friends every week on Zoom, which is
That's
great.
so good. I love Kyrie.
Oh, Kyrie's the best.
I
I'm
love
so
her
glad that
laugh.
we,
Getting her to laugh is the best.
I've heard
yeah.
of Kyrie through the multiple screenshots
You
that
need to make it back to room, Brady.
I
You need
know.
to make
I
it
was
back
like,
to
how have I
room.
never met this
That's
person?
right. You
All the
were at
things
room
on
this
this slide
past year,
are the
were you?
intersection of the things I like. We need to find. Yeah, we just need to have a. I mean, like, I guess this is kind
Kelsey.
of the space right now. The like people doing the weird methods and weird stuff, but fun, humanizing, critical stuff. Because I feel like a lot of us think and do similar things. Oh yeah,
Read this book?
Yes. I
Read
read that
this
book a few
book?
years ago. I love it. I haven't used
I'm
those
reading it for our
words.
research project.
Oh, you're using it for a research project?
Yeah, we're for the trans mathematicians project. One of our participants referenced
Mm.
it, and Reagan was like, "Well, Davis, go read it." It's been a joy.
Incredible. So you're reading
Been
it
a joy.
now?
Yeah, it's been really cool.
Yeah, the ingressive and congressive. I haven't used those terms in a while, but I really appreciate that, like, getting specific about, like, the behaviors and, like, values that are what people are, like, gravitating towards.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I unfortunately do need to go back to studying for my qualifying exam next week. Everyone send me good numerical analysis with differential equation vibes.
I was just gonna say the vibes.
I don't know if
Yeah.
you want my vibes because I don't know what those even look like, honestly.
You know, at this point, I feel like truncation error and I have grown a beautiful and intimate relationship. I'm not sure I wanted that for my life, but it's happened, and that's okay. But this was such a joy to talk with you guys and be in community, and thank you again, Matt, for inviting me. I really appreciated it, and I
Yeah.
hope you all have good end of semesters.
Yeah. All right. Thanks,
Yeah, you
Davis,
too. Thank
for presenting. This was real great. I think everyone had a great time. And yeah, thank you to everyone else for coming. And we will see you soon, hopefully.
Awesome.
Oh yeah,
Bye.
Matt, can we talk about that for a second? Take care.
Yeah, yeah.
Are we